Hello everyone, Phoenix Knight here. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to a new video on the channel. No gameplay in this one. Instead, I want to talk about my Tac Up Wargaming list now that my list is complete. In this video, we're going to rank the 10 games on the list for my 2023 Tac Up Wargaming 10 game challenge. For those of you who are watching this video immediately after seeing my original video setting out my list, my original 2023 release was going to be Air Raid Pearl Harbor, but that didn't end up coming out in time to be included on this list, and it doesn't look like it's going to this year. So, I swapped it out for Target for today. From that swap, Atlantic Chase, thanks to its reprint earlier this year, slid into the 2023 release spot. Anyway, to rank these 10 games, I gave each game a score of 1 to 10 in 5 different categories. First, on the theme. Now, this isn't necessarily about how interesting I found the theme, but that does play into it. This is more about how well do I think the theme came through in each game. Next, the mechanics. Mechanically, how interesting was each game to play? Wargaming is a whole new arena to me, so engaging mechanics are important to keeping me in this part of the hobby. Next up, we had ease of learning, and this refers to how much outside-the-box help I needed to learn a game. If a game has a learn-to-play guide in the box and I use that, I'm not going to knock the game for that because that's obviously in-the-box help that I'm getting. Now, if I have to watch a video, I won't automatically knock the points off the game for that, because there are a lot of times where I watch a video in a case of I'm most of the way to making sense of this game, but there's this one small thing that just isn't making sense to me. So sometimes the video helps me piece that together. But if I'm watching multiple videos and I'm still kind of puzzled, wondering what's going on, that's where I start knocking points off. Next up, we have the rulebook. This ties in with ease of learning in that I tend to live in the rulebook when I'm learning a game, but it's different enough that I broke it out separately. Now, if I need to find a rule while I'm learning a game, or while I'm filming a video, I typically need to be able to find it quickly. Here I'm talking about how easy the rulebook is to use and how complete it is. I tend to lean hard into this category as, like I've mentioned, Wargaming is a new arena for me this year, so I've been in a lot of rulebooks. And I know rulebooks aren't perfect, but they're supposed to be a good starting point. Plus, they don't always account for more involved interactions. So the more I start needing to look outside the rulebook, that's when I start to knock more off of the rulebook. Finally, the fun factor. Just like it sounds, did I have fun playing the game? So the ranking is based on the sum of the 5 values for a maximum total of 50 points. And to the surprise of probably almost no one, no game hit this maximum, but the top 2 to 3 did come close. With the methodology of the list explained, let's go ahead and get into the rankings, and we'll start off, fittingly enough, with number 10. My number 10 game was Metal Dawn from Everything Epic Games. In this game, you take control of a squad of humans against a military AI Indominus that has gone sentient and wants to exterminate humanity. If you saw my video of Metal Dawn back in February, you won't be surprised to see how harsh I'm going to be on this game. Scores will be on the screen now. So G.I. Joe vs. Skynet is an interesting theme that a game company should be able to do well with, but in my opinion, this wasn't that game. I did feel the theme was done well in this game and came through, but there were a lot of other problems with this game. Mechanically, it felt maybe a touch simplistic, especially in comparison with some of the other games on the list, which should have made for a good intro to wargaming, and that part kind of did. The Metal Dawn track was easy for me to wrap my mind around once I thought Doom track, exact same idea. For being a somewhat simplistic game, this one seemed a little bit confusing to me to learn. I had to watch Jester's playthrough of this game a few times to make sense of it, and even after that I was still a little bit confused. And the rulebook was no help on that. I might have missed it, but I never did get a clear answer of where the characters are supposed to start. I assumed it would have been the White House, but any location with an intel marker probably would work if you play a game without the White House. This was not a game I had fun playing. I described it as throw through the window bad at the time of the video, and I think a lot of the problem with it was how the game cascades from this is survivable but not great to you just lose the game on the spot. This is one of those games where once you get stuck, odds are I get the feeling you're not going to recover. In fact, I even needed a house rule for when the drones spawn during the Dominus phase. Because what would end up happening, it rules as written, is if you end up getting the right situation, you can end up going through the rest of the Doom track, getting up to Metal Dawn, and there's really nothing you can do there. So I had to put a house rule in that anything that spawns during the Dominus phase doesn't attack during the Dominus phase, just to try to mitigate it a little bit. So one more question I want to address with each game is, do I see it hitting the channel again? Seeing as I described this Metal Dawn as throw it through the window bad, you can feel free to do the math on that one. So with that, let's move on to number 9. My number 9 game was On to Moscow from Worthington Games. In this one, you take control of the German forces invading the Soviet Union during World War II, with the goal to get as far as you can, hence the name On to Moscow. This is another one I'm going to be somewhat harsh on. Some of my comments might surprise you, though, but scores are on the screen now. So one problem inherent with these book games, in my opinion, is the theme can sometimes be hard to bring through, especially when you sometimes have to rely heavily on theater of the mind. And I've never been very good with theater of the mind, which is why I do some of the things I do when I feature Title Bout 2 on the channel. The mechanics here were very simplistic, if very chance-based, and I almost thought it was a touch too chance-based. Like the theme being hard to bring through, this seems to be a problem inherent with the book games, at least for the 2 I've played, and some of that, I realize some of that is just the nature of warfare, but even still, I feel like there should be some mitigation available to that. I was playing around with a house rule potentially on some of that mitigation, but I never got this game back to the table where I'd feel comfortable trying that out again. Learning this one wasn't too bad. It helped to have the rules in the same book, but that can be somewhat of a double-edged sword with these book games, where if you like it enough to play completely through the book, you might have to buy several copies of it, which can make the game get somewhat repetitive. The rulebook was good and helped make everything clear, but this was another game I didn't have much fun with. This game was a little too chance-based for my tastes, and knowing I would need another copy if I liked it was no help. It didn't help either when I'd see an action just be wiped out by an event making it impossible to do so. That was probably the biggest source of my frustration with this game, where you could get everything all set, you got a plan in action, you only roll one action for the turn, you go to set everything up, then an event just wipes the action out and makes it impossible to do. So you essentially get on that treadmill, even worse, I think, where you can't really take advantage of anything. So in terms of another game that might hit the channel again, this one will not. With that, let's move to number 8. My number 8 game was my other book game, Bismarck Solitaire, also from Worthington Games. In this one, you take control of the Bismarck, Prinz Eugen, and a U-boat on a sortie into the North Atlantic after the other ships in the Bismarck story. Rankings will be on screen now. So I've talked about general book game musings with On to Moscow, so I won't come back to those again. Most of why I had more fun with this game was because the lost events, while no less frustrating, felt thematically easier to swallow because you are on the Atlantic Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean is a very big place. And you can also try to at least reposition to try to take advantage of a certain event in the next turn. So even if you lose an entire turn to a bad event, you can at least try to take advantage of something else. Another no on the channel repeat question. With that, let's move on to number 7. My number 7 game was Absolute War, the Russian Front 1941-45 from GMT Games. This game takes you to the Soviet Union to play out World War II on the Eastern Front from the start of Operation Barbarossa to Victory in Europe Day. Admittedly, this is a game I've gone back and forth on in terms of how harsh I wanted to be on it, but I'll talk about that more after you have a chance to see the scores, which are on screen now. I did notice the theme in this game. Most of these historic games seem to be true to history, so that's definitely a plus. It's something of a double-edged sword, though. I'm not going to talk about it here, but file that away for now. We're going to come back to it. For a game I actually had a fairly hard time grasping, the mechanics here were actually very interesting, and I surprisingly had fun playing this game despite this one not being easy to learn. Tutorial videos and other learning aids were sorely lacking for this game, and the rule book was very, very confusing. I ended up leaning fairly hard on the extended example of play in the rule book to help me make sense of the game, and even then, the video I put up seemed to be fairly clunky. Ultimately, I do think there's a very good game here, but I definitely need to spend more time with this one. Unfortunately, there's also a heavy scenario focus here, and I think that's eventually going to cause problems in terms of the replayability. Granted, there are a few scenarios in the box, plus the basic and long campaign games, so that'll be a while yet. But it is worth noting the scenario focus present in this game. I do see this one hitting the channel again with the different scenarios, but I need to spend more time with the game to hopefully smooth out some of the very rough edges. It'll probably also be Sunday content. I scheduled this one on the Wednesday, I think it was after the anniversary of Operation Barbarossa's launch, but that was a total disaster. Because it ended up, for a 6-turn video, I was expecting it to be maybe a reasonable length. It ended up being well over 2 hours, which is definitely over the threshold of where I feel comfortable with Wednesday night videos. So this will definitely be Sunday content. But again, I also need to spend more time to try to iron out the rough edges. Anyway, on to number 6. My number 6 game was Hitler's Reich from GMT Games. On the channel, we played through 1942 as we simulated World War II, but you can go through the entire war. Scores will be on the screen now. The theme also came through in this game. The cards on the board were both historically accurate, and the game even comes with historic operations. We saw Barbarossa at work in the video, but there are also rules for Overlord and Bagration to be used in the game. Mechanically, it felt like the decision space was a bit limited, so that hurt it a bit. This game was definitely a chore to learn, and I blame the rulebook for that one. Videos were sorely limited when I was trying to learn Hitler's Reich, and a very confusing rulebook did me no favors. It wasn't until I went and found the living rules that I was really able to get my mind around this game. Plus, the living rules were also laid out a lot more logically, so that helped me to make sense of this game. Ultimately, when it was all said and done, I ended up having fun playing this game, and I could see this one landing in one of two places. Either at the end of January as a historical date of significance for when the Nazis came to power in Germany, or the end of April, early May to commemorate the suicide of Adolf Hitler and the end of World War II. This would get paired together with Black Orchestra if it lands in May, but I'm leaning toward the end of January just because that May time is already very crowded with a spring campaign for Arkham Horror, the card game. Granted, I'd probably face the same interruption around the winter campaign, but no plan is perfect. So ultimately, I will probably just have to bite the bullet on one of the campaigns getting interrupted. Anyway, on to number 5. My number 5 game was Field Commander Rommel from Dan Burson Games. In this game, we take on the role of Erwin Rommel in some of his most famous campaigns, Ghost Division, D-Day, and El Alamein. Scores will be up on the screen now. I didn't really feel the theme come through in this one. I think some of it is just the small size of the game. There were still some chance-based mechanics in this game similar to the book games, but I felt like the player had more agency in this game than in the book games. Even just opening up the map more seemed to have a big impact on the player agency. As for the rulebook, it felt pretty straightforward in this game, and I ended up having fun with this game. I do have major concerns about the replayability, however, especially with losing being written into 2 of the 3 scenarios in the box. And yes, I do understand being faithful to the history and the source material, but with a game like Absolute War, there's even an opportunity in there to explore some of the alternate history, like the Nazis winning Barbarossa by getting all the way to Moscow, such as what happened in our playthrough of Absolute War. All told though, I did enjoy playing this game, but I don't see it as a forever game for me, and not a game that's going to make another appearance on the channel. As such, this one's landing in the sell pile, and one of the big problems for me is the lack of replayability. Once you get through a map, you've largely played it, and I don't think the various campaign options do enough to make you want to pull it out again. Plus, as I mentioned, the narrative seems to be pre-written, and it's very on rails with the settings so rigidly defined. And yes, some of that is the history, but even if the units have to be largely predefined, I feel like there should be some liberties with the outcomes available. This is what I was talking about earlier, by being faithful to history being a double-edged sword. It's definitely possible to be faithful to history, but games need to be too careful not to seem too faithful. For me at least, and this isn't the last time I'm going to talk about it, I like having the historical theme, but not necessarily the script. But I'm starting to ramble now. On to number 4. My number 4 game was Target for Today from Legion Wargames. In this game, we get dropped into a US bomber in Nazi-occupied Europe with a very heavy narrative focus on trying to last through an entire 20-something mission campaign. Scores will be on the screen now. The theme definitely came through in this game, but you are having to rely very heavily on theater of the mind for the experience. The board is just a bomber and spots for enemy fighters to go depending on where they spawn. Mechanically, the game is very simple to learn, but the mechanics can be a little monotonous. All this game is roll some dice, then consult the chart, rinse and repeat. I don't mind it with a heavy narrative focus, but I can definitely see how some people might object to the repetitive nature of roll the dice, then consult the chart. In a way, this game almost sort of feels like guided storytelling, which I loathe. The reason I don't mind it, though, is you're being guided through your own story, where I call this game more prompted storytelling, essentially. Let me explain the difference between prompted and guided storytelling. So if you're getting prompted with storytelling like you are here, you're getting the prompt of, hey, you have this weather in the zone, work it into your narrative, or hey, here's an event that happened on your bombing run, work it into your narrative, that kind of thing. Whereas in something like the Call of Cthulhu Alone Adventures, you're essentially walking through their story, and your agency is a little bit limited to what they've written into that adventure. It's the same thing with a game like Escape the Dark Sector, where it's almost more guided storytelling, where you're walking through their narrative, and you're just making the incidental choices to it, rather than, hey, here's what's happening to you, work it into your own narrative kind of thing. Then probably rambling a little bit, but hopefully that makes some sense of where I'm going with it. So, as I mentioned, this game is very easy to learn. The rulebook has a lot of historical context to it, so it's interesting from that perspective, but it also made the rulebook, in my opinion, unnecessarily thick. I was able to find everything I needed, and I think I would have liked the rulebook a lot better if the historical context was maybe broken out in a separate book and pointed to each rule to say, this is why we made this part of the game. All that said, though, I really enjoyed this game, and I definitely see it hitting the channel again. With that, let's move on to number 3. My number 3 game was Atlantic Chase from GMT Games. In this game, you get dropped into the naval confrontation between the Kriegsmarine and the Home Fleet during World War II in the Atlantic Ocean. Scores will be on the screen now. This game was one of only 2 that came with a separate Learn-to-Play-esque guide in the box. The Learn-to-Play guide in this game took on the form of tutorial scenarios designed to teach you all the actions in Atlantic Chase. As a novice wargamer, it's a huge plus to me when a game comes with something like that. Atlantic Chase wasn't particularly hard to learn, I don't think. What it was time-consuming. It probably took me a solid week of game time to get the feel for the actions. And I only really had problems with one of the actions where I had to redo one of the tutorial scenarios, but I was able to make sense of everything fairly easily, and because of the tutorial scenarios, I didn't need too much outside-the-box help. The theme was an interesting one with the various stories, even if the narrative was still somewhat predefined and constrained by history. The rulebook was also very well laid out, to where I was able to find what I needed, and I had fun with this game. It'll probably hit the channel again, but only as Sunday content. It fell right on the edge of what I consider weeknight content, and while the Wednesday playthrough we did worked out, after my Wednesday disaster with Absolute War back in June, I'd rather not chance it unless I'm completely sure. Anyway, on to number 2. My number 2 game was Star Wars Imperial Assault from Fantasy Flight Games. This game drops us into the Star Wars universe right after the destruction of the first Death Star in the role of rebel heroes trying to escape Yavin 4. At least, that's true in the introductory campaign. There are several other campaigns in the game. Scores will be on the screen now. If you're familiar with Descent 2nd Edition Journeys in the Dark, this is the exact same game with a sci-fi coat of paint. The combination of a familiar coat of paint and getting away from the one versus all mechanics I absolutely loathe in games, except in very rare cases, helped me enjoy this game. The theme also came through, especially in some of the little details, like Darth Vader's feared breathing, which you probably heard in the video. The mechanics were very interesting, but I do think there could have been more to do. This was a very easy game to learn, especially with the Learn to Play in the guide in the box. The combination of that and a tutorial scenario made this one a breeze to learn. I had a lot of fun playing this game, so the question of will it hit the channel again will surprise you with the answer most likely. I don't see this game hitting the channel again, and most of that is because the app was very difficult to film around. I could add in more camera cuts so we don't have such a rough transition from the app to the board and back again, but we're cutting back so often that it would break up the flow of the video. I feel better about cutting back and forth between the app and the board with something like Mansions of Madness, but even then, there's still the problem of not being able to read everything on the app. But I'll have to play around with it a little bit. Anyway, you've probably guessed what number 1 is, but let's reveal it anyway. My number 1 game, as you've probably guessed, was Space Empires 4X from GMT Games. In this game, we're building up our empire to take on either other players or the Doomsday Machines. In the solo game, we're after the Doomsday Machines, and we have to destroy 3 of them to win the game. Scores will be on the screen now. As I was first stepping into wargaming, I knew I wanted at least one sci-fi game on that front. This was the first game that caught my eye on the space front, and I'm very glad it did. Of the 4 games on the list, I would say this one was the easiest to learn, and unlike with Atlantic Chase, this one was a fairly quick learn. I still needed some clarifications during the video playthrough, but that tends to be the nature of the beast. I definitely felt the theme come through in this game if the art style was maybe a touch simplistic for space. The mechanics were also engaging, and the game was very easy to learn, probably helped by a very small rulebook. For a GMT rulebook, this was a pretty good one, mostly because it was fairly short but easy to follow. I also had a blast playing this game, and you guys haven't seen the last of this game on the channel. This is definitely an operational level game, but I think there's enough tactical action here as well to scratch that itch. In other words, it's the right balance for me in a war game where I tend to prefer tactical games. With that, let's wrap this video up. That is my first year complete with the Tac Up Wargaming 10-game challenge. It's been a very interesting year, but I discovered I prefer tactical level games. I'll talk about that more in my eventual end-of-year wargame recap. There are also still more wargames coming on the channel this year. As for next year, I'll probably participate in the challenge again, but next year's list is going to look very different with my newfound preference for tactical level games. Anyway, I'm getting very rambly at this point, so let's wrap this video up. Saturday, we're on track with Mystical Munchies to make the dessert out of the Necro Nom Nom Nom. Chocolate whoopie pies with strawberry jam, also known as Moonbeast pies. Sunday, we're playing Terra Mystica. And Wednesday next week, we're going to debut another Air War game from Danverson Games this time, as we play Hornet Leader, Carrier Air Operations. Thank you for watching the video. Please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to turn on notifications so you get my content. Be well, stay safe, take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and I'll be back with more videos in the future. Until then, take care everyone.